What I'm about to tell you was buried for 60 years. The music industry tried to erase it. The media refused to report it. Even the Beatles themselves never spoke publicly about what happened that night. But 20,000 people witnessed it. And those who were there? They've been whispering about it ever since. This is the story they didn't want you to hear. August 15, 1965. Shea Stadium, New York. The Beatles are about to perform what would become the most talked about concert in rock history. But not for the reasons you think. Picture this. 20,000 screaming fans packed tighter than sardines. The air thick with teenage hysteria and summer heat. Security guards sweating through their uniforms, knowing they're one spark away from total chaos. The Beatles walk onto that stage like gods descending from heaven. John, Paul, George, Ringo. 4 names that had already changed the world. Tonight, they're about to learn something that would haunt them forever. The opening chord strikes. 20,000 voices explode in unison. But something's wrong. Something the official footage will never show you. Something that was deliberately edited out of every recording. From the crowd, a figure emerges. Stumbling, shouting, moving with the desperate determination of a man who has nothing left to lose. At first, security thinks he's just another fan. Another lovesick teenager trying to touch greatness. But this man is different. Older, angrier, and he's heading straight for the stage with murder in his eyes. What happens next will make you question everything you thought you knew about fame, about humanity, and about the price of dreams deferred. But before I reveal the secret that the music industry spent decades trying to hide, I need you to do something. Hit that subscribe button right now, because once you hear this story, you'll never look at the Beatles the same way again. And trust me, you don't want to miss what comes next. The drunk man breaks through the front barrier like it's made of paper. His name? Jimmy Morrison. Not Jim Morrison from The Doors. Jimmy Morrison from Queens. A nobody who was about to become part of rock and roll legend whether the world wanted it or not. 20,000 people freeze. The screaming stops like someone pulled a plug. You could hear a pin drop in that massive stadium. Jimmy Morrison stumbles onto the stage, and for the first time in their careers, the Beatles look genuinely afraid. Stop. Jimmy screams, his voice cutting through the silence like a chainsaw.
Just stop this madness.
John's fingers freeze on his guitar strings. Paul's bass line dies mid-note. George takes a step backward. Ringo's drumsticks hover in midair. But here's what nobody saw coming. Instead of calling security, John Lennon does the unthinkable. He holds up his hand, a gesture that says, "Wait, let him speak." The crowd gasps. Security guards look confused. Even the other Beatles stare at John like he's lost his mind. Jimmy sways on his feet, but his eyes burn with something deeper than alcohol. Something that looks like pure, concentrated rage mixed with heartbreak. "You think you're special," he slurs, pointing an accusatory finger at the 4 young men. "You think your noise means something? I had dreams too. I had dreams too, and look what happened to them." The stadium falls into a silence so profound it feels like the world has stopped spinning. But what Jimmy says next changes everything. "I wrote songs before you were even born. I played the same clubs in Hamburg you played. I was there first. I was there first." Suddenly, this isn't just a drunk heckler anymore. This is something else entirely. Something the music industry has been hiding for decades. Research that took years to uncover revealed the truth about Jimmy Morrison. He wasn't just some random drunk. He was a session musician in the early 60s. He played bass for small independent labels. He had written songs that almost made it big. Songs that sounded suspiciously similar to early Beatles tracks. Coincidence? Or something darker? Paul McCartney tries to resume playing, clearly desperate to salvage the situation. But Jimmy lurches toward him with surprising agility for a drunk man. The microphone stand wobbles dangerously. For a split second, 20,000 people think they're about to witness violence on live television. That's when George Harrison does something that defies every rule of show business. He walks directly toward the drunk man. Not aggressively, not defensively. He approaches Jimmy like he's approaching a wounded animal that might bite. "What's your name?" George asks quietly, but the stadium's acoustics carry his words to every corner of the venue. The question hits Jimmy like a physical blow. His shoulders shake. His defiance cracks like cheap plaster. "Jimmy," he whispers. Then louder, his voice breaking. "Jimmy Morrison from Queens. Not the Morrison everyone will remember. Just Jimmy Morrison who never made it." And in that moment, 20,000 people realize they're not looking at a heckler anymore. They're looking at the ghost of dreams that never came true. But the story gets infinitely stranger. Because what the Beatles did next violated every rule of fame, every principle of image management, every lesson they'd learned about protecting themselves from the chaos of celebrity. John Lennon puts down his guitar and walks over to Jimmy. Not to remove him, not to call security. He sits down on the edge of the stage, right next to this drunk, broken stranger. "Tell us about your songs, Jimmy," John says conversationally, like they're old friends catching up over coffee. The crowd is mesmerized. This isn't the concert they paid for. This is something else entirely. Something real. Something dangerous. Something that could destroy careers if it goes wrong. Jimmy's face crumples. Tears mix with the alcohol on his breath as he starts to speak. I wrote Love Me Do in 1958, he says, his voice barely above a whisper but somehow audible to everyone. Different words, different melody, but the same feeling. I played it at the Cavern Club 3 years before you ever set foot in there. A collective gasp ripples through the stadium. The Beatles exchange glances that seem to carry entire conversations. But instead of denying it, instead of defending themselves, Paul McCartney does something that shocks everyone. He nods. Music belongs to everyone, Jimmy, Paul says gently. Ideas float around until someone catches them. Maybe we caught the same idea you let slip away. The honesty is brutal, beautiful, devastating. Jimmy Morrison breaks down completely then. Not the theatrical breakdown of a drunk seeking attention. The real, raw breakdown of a man confronting the life he could have had. I had a family, he sobs. I had kids who looked up to me. I told them Daddy was going to be famous someday. I promised them we'd have a big house and they'd be proud to tell their friends who their father was. Ringo Starr climbs down from his drum kit. Without a word, he takes off his jacket and drapes it around Jimmy's shoulders like he's comforting a child. What happened to them? Ringo asks softly. Gone? Jimmy whispers. All gone. My wife remarried a man who could provide for them. My kids call someone else daddy now. And I'm here, drunk in front of 20,000 people, begging the men who lived my dream to acknowledge that I existed. The silence that follows is sacred. 20,000 people holding their breath, witnessing something they never expected to see. Something raw and human and utterly unpredictable. But here's where the story takes a turn that nobody saw coming. Instead of having Jimmy quietly removed, the Beatles do something that defies logic, defies their management, defies every rule of celebrity self-preservation. They invite him to stay. Jimmy, John says, standing up and extending his hand. Would you like to hear us play your song? My song. Jimmy looks confused. The song you almost wrote? George clarifies. The song you would have written if the world had been different, if timing had been kinder, if dreams came true in the order they deserved to. And here's the question I want you to answer in the comments below. Have you ever met someone who was living your alternate life? Someone who showed you what could have happened if you'd made different choices? Tell me about it, because what happened next proves that sometimes the most powerful performances happen when the music stops. Paul picks up his bass and starts playing something slow, something gentle, something that sounds like a lullaby for broken dreams. But it's not any Beatles song you've ever heard. It's improvisational, raw, built from the emotional wreckage of this moment. George joins in with delicate guitar work that sounds like hope trying to bloom in concrete. Ringo's drumming is soft, like a heartbeat in the dark. And then John starts singing. Not Beatles lyrics. Not any lyrics at all, really. Just wordless melody that somehow captures everything Jimmy Morrison had wanted to say with his music but never found the courage to express. They're playing Jimmy's unwritten song. The song that existed only in his dreams. The song that died when his family left and his hope crumbled and his bottles became more reliable than his ambitions. Jimmy Morrison sits on the edge of that stage, tears streaming down his face, listening to the Beatles perform the symphony of his broken heart. 20,000 people stand in absolute silence, witnessing something that transcends music, something that feels like prayer, something that feels like forgiveness. When the improvisation ends, nobody moves, nobody breathes. The silence stretches until it becomes its own kind of music. Then Jimmy Morrison stands up, slowly, unsteadily, but with a dignity that wasn't there before. Thank you, he says simply, for letting me exist for a moment. John Lennon embraces him, not for show, not for the cameras, just one human being acknowledging another human being's right to matter. Security approaches then, but gently, respectfully, like they're helping an honored guest find his way home rather than removing an unwanted intruder. As Jimmy reaches the edge of the stage, he turns back to the Beatles one final time. I forgive you, he says, for living the life I couldn't. John nods. We forgive you too, Jimmy, for showing us what it costs. The crowd erupts then, but not in hysteria, in something deeper, in recognition of having witnessed something profound, something that would live in their memories longer than any hit song. But here's where the story gets really interesting. The official footage of that night? It was mysteriously damaged during processing. The audio recordings? Technical difficulties wiped out several crucial minutes. The newspaper reviews the next day? They focused on the music and ignored the interruption entirely. Someone didn't want this story to survive, but 20,000 people were there. 20,000 witnesses to an act of humanity that the music industry apparently decided was too dangerous to document. Why? What were they afraid of? Maybe they were afraid that people would realize fame is just luck and timing. Maybe they were afraid that audiences would demand more authenticity from their idols. Maybe they were afraid that one broken man's courage to speak his truth might inspire others to do the same. For decades, this story lived only in whispered conversations between people who had been there. Do you remember the night when they would start, and others would nod knowingly? The Beatles themselves rarely spoke about it publicly, but privately, Privately, they credited that night with teaching them something crucial about the responsibility that comes with living other people's dreams. John Lennon supposedly kept Jimmy's name in a notebook for years afterward. Paul McCartney was rumored to have tried tracking him down, wanting to help somehow. George Harrison mentioned in a few interviews about the night we learned that success is just surviving failure with witnesses. But Jimmy Morrison? He vanished back into the anonymous crowds of New York City like a ghost returning to haunt familiar streets. Some say he got sober after that night. Others claim he never touched alcohol again. There are rumors he became a music teacher in Queens, helping kids learn instruments he'd given up playing professionally. Other stories suggest he moved away entirely, starting over somewhere nobody knew his name or his story. The truth? Nobody knows for certain. What we do know is this: 20,000 people left Shea Stadium that night forever changed. Not by the Beatles' performance, but by their humanity. They had witnessed 4 young men at the absolute peak of fame choose compassion over convenience, vulnerability over safety, truth over image management. They had seen what happens when greatness is measured not by how high you rise, but by how gently you help others up from their knees. But let me ask you something else, and I want to see your thoughts in the comments. In our social media age, where everyone's performing their perfect life, would the Beatles' response be possible today? Would a celebrity risk their image to show genuine compassion to someone having a breakdown? Or have we become too afraid of vulnerability going viral for the wrong reasons? Because what happened that night at Shea Stadium wasn't just about music. It was about what we're capable of when we stop protecting our images long enough to recognize someone else's pain. Jimmy Morrison wasn't just a drunk heckler. He was a mirror, a reflection of everyone who has ever watched someone else live the life they dreamed of having. The Beatles were symbols of endless possibility, of dreams coming true, of talent being rewarded. But Jimmy? Jimmy was the other side of that coin. The reminder that for every dream that comes true, 1,000 others die in darkness. And instead of looking away from that uncomfortable truth, the Beatles embraced it. Instead of pretending success is only about talent and hard work, they acknowledged the role of luck and timing and circumstances beyond anyone's control. Instead of treating Jimmy like an obstacle to their performance, they treated him like the main event. That night, they proved that real strength isn't about never falling down. It's about helping others get back up. And sometimes, it's about acknowledging that you're standing where someone else deserved to be. The Beatles continued their concert after Jimmy was gone. They played Twist and Shout with an intensity that seemed to shake the stadium's foundations. They played She Loves You like a promise to never forget what they'd learned. They played Help like they finally understood what the word meant. But everyone who was there agreed, the most powerful moment of the night wasn't any song they performed. It was the song they improvised for one broken man who needed to know his dreams had mattered. Years later, when journalists would ask the Beatles about their most meaningful performance, they would often reference that night at Shea. Not the official concert, not the screaming crowds or the hit songs. The night they stopped being performers and became human beings. Fame is a strange thing, John Lennon once reflected in a rare candid moment. It makes you feel invincible until someone reminds you that you're just occupying space that could have belonged to anyone. Jimmy Morrison taught us that our success wasn't just our own. It was borrowed from all the people who dreamed the same dreams but didn't get the same chances. Paul would add, "We thought we were special because we made it." Jimmy showed us we were just lucky, and that made us more grateful than any hit record ever could. George, always the philosopher, that night, we learned that the most important music isn't the kind that makes you famous. It's the kind that makes you remember you're human. And Ringo, with his characteristic wisdom disguised as simplicity, best show we ever played was for an audience of one broken man who needed to hear that his dreams had mattered. But here's what haunts me most about this story. Jimmy Morrison was just one voice in that crowd of 20,000. One broken soul among all those screaming fans. One person whose dreams had curdled into desperation and alcohol. How many Jimmy Morrisons are out there right now? How many people are drowning in plain sight while the world scrolls past them toward the next trending topic? How many times do we mistake someone's cry for help as mere noise in our feeds? The Beatles didn't just perform that night, they performed humanity. They showed 20,000 people that fame without compassion is just noise, that success without empathy is hollow victory. But most importantly, they proved that sometimes the most revolutionary act isn't playing music. It's stopping the music to listen to someone who desperately needs to be heard. Think about the courage that required. 4 young men at the absolute pinnacle of their careers. They could have had Jimmy removed in 30 seconds. They could have pretended it never happened. They could have protected their carefully crafted image and moved on with their scheduled performance. Instead, they risked everything. Their reputation, their safety, their tour schedule, their relationship with their management, for one broken stranger, one forgotten dreamer, one man the world had decided didn't matter. And in doing so, they created something more powerful than any song they ever recorded. They created a moment of pure human connection that transcended music, transcended fame, transcended every artificial barrier we build between ourselves and strangers. But the most beautiful part isn't what the Beatles did. It's what happened to those 20,000 witnesses. They left that stadium fundamentally changed. Not by the music they heard, but by the humanity they witnessed. They had seen what courage looks like when nobody's filming it for social media. They had learned what strength means when it's not performed for applause. 4 decades afterward, many of those fans would tell stories about that night. But not stories about John's charisma or Paul's talent or George's guitar work or Ringo's rhythm. They would tell stories about 4 young men who taught them what bravery really means. They would remember that sometimes the most courageous thing you can do isn't fight back, but reach out. They would understand that true power isn't about being invincible, but about being vulnerable enough to let someone else's pain matter more than your own comfort. And maybe, just maybe, some of those fans carried that lesson forward. Maybe they stopped scrolling when they saw someone crying for help online. Maybe they chose compassion over judgment when they encountered someone having a breakdown. Maybe they remembered that behind every angry voice is usually just a broken heart. If that's true, then Jimmy Morrison's interruption wasn't chaos at all. It was exactly what 20,000 people needed to see. So here's my final question, and I really want your honest thoughts in the comments below. In a world obsessed with viral content and perfect moments, how do we make space for the Jimmy Morrisons? How do we learn to see the humanity in the heckler? How do we find the courage to stop our perfectly curated performances and simply listen to someone who desperately needs to be heard? Because that night at Shea Stadium, the Beatles taught us something profound about fame, about success, about the thin line between making it and breaking down. They showed us that greatness isn't measured by how high you rise above everyone else, but by how willing you are to climb down and lift someone up. They proved that sometimes the most important voice in a stadium full of screaming fans is the one that's crying instead of cheering. They reminded us all that behind every person who seems angry or drunk or out of line is usually just someone who forgot they mattered. Jimmy Morrison from Queens may have been intoxicated that night. He may have been desperate. He may have interrupted the biggest concert of the year. But he wasn't wrong about one thing. We all need someone to hear us. We all deserve a moment when our dreams matter to someone else. We all want to believe that our existence leaves some kind of mark on the world. And sometimes, if we're incredibly fortunate, we encounter people who understand that the most beautiful music isn't always the kind that comes from instruments. Sometimes it's the sound of one human heart recognizing another human heart's right to be broken and still be beautiful. That night, 20,000 people witnessed something extraordinary. Not a concert, not entertainment. They witnessed grace under pressure. They witnessed what happens when empathy becomes more important than ego. And maybe that's why this story was buried. Maybe some truths are too powerful for the music industry to handle. Maybe some acts of humanity threaten the carefully constructed mythology of celebrity culture. Maybe what happened between the Beatles and Jimmy Morrison that night was too real for a world that prefers its heroes sanitized and its stories simple. But the 20,000 who were there, they knew they had witnessed something sacred. Something that would live in their memories longer than any hit song. Something that would change how they treated strangers, how they responded to people in crisis, how they understood the weight of their own good fortune. The Beatles went on to change music history with their innovations and artistry. But that night at Shea Stadium, they changed something more important. They changed what it means to be human when the whole world is watching. And Jimmy Morrison from Queens, wherever he ended up, hopefully knew that for those brief, shining moments on a summer night in 1965, 4 young men stopped time itself just to listen to his song. That's not just rock and roll history. That's the history of what we're capable of when we choose love over fear, understanding over judgment, connection over protection, when we choose to hear the cry behind the chaos. So the next time someone interrupts your perfectly planned day with their messy desperation, remember Jimmy Morrison. Remember the Beatles. Remember that sometimes the most important thing you can do is stop everything and simply listen. You might just save someone's life, and in the process, you might save your own soul. Because that night taught us that fame doesn't only attract cheers, it also attracts broken voices desperate to be heard. But here's the question that should haunt every one of us as we scroll through our feeds and live our curated lives. Was Jimmy Morrison's breakdown just random chaos that interrupted a concert? Or was it the universe's way of reminding us that behind every success story are countless others who never got their chance to be heard? The answer lives in the space between madness and mercy, between breakdown and breakthrough, between the life we're living and the lives we're not brave enough to acknowledge. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly where the most important truths have always been waiting for us to find them.